Well, Parsifal. Parsifal, I think, is the most elusive of all operas. It's also, I find, one of the most difficult operas to appreciate. I first heard my Parsifal when I was about 22 years old in Stockholm, and I hadn't slept the night before. That wasn't much of a guarantee that I was going to appreciate what I was going to be hearing. But actually, it is really, it's over the years, I have come to sort of to listen to Parsifal more and more. And this afternoon, as I was watching the first act, I thought this is actually the most enjoyable Parsifal that I have ever heard, just because I found myself so completely at one with the music. But it is one of those works that takes a lifetime, I think, to appreciate. Parsifal came into the world shrouded in ceremony and mystique. For years, the Bayreuth clan managed to successfully restrict performances of Parsifal just to the Bayreuth Festspielhaus. In fact, this festival play consecrating a stage could only be performed in one place. And when eventually it was performed elsewhere, it was the Metropolitan Opera that was out of sort of the immediate range of the missiles from the Wagner Foundation. Now, of course, Parsifal is done everywhere, and in German-speaking countries in particular, it is an occasional opera to the extent that it is very widely done on Good Friday. It is one of the few operas that seems to have its own particular day. I actually nearly went to Amsterdam last winter, but sadly couldn't make it. And I was looking up the Amsterdam, or the Dutch Opera in Amsterdam, and I saw they were doing Parsifal on Christmas Day. I thought, what a wonderful, it's actually a wonderful time to do Parsifal. It's sort of because Parsifal, after all, does express in many ways several of the central values in Parsifal. And Parsifal also occupied a very special place in Wagner's output. Of all his operas, it was the one that had the longest gestation period, even longer actually than The Ring. Let's just have a quick look at the dates of the composition. First, in 1845, Wagner read Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parsifal and Titurel, and this is where he became very interested in the story of Parsifal. In 1857, he had his famous asile experience when he was living in the garden of the Wesendonks, and he came out of the little hut in which he was living, and there was this wonderful day that he claimed was Good Friday. Actually, it wasn't, but actually it did give him the idea for the Good Friday music, the fact that when nature is suddenly blooming and is new, there is a transcendental experience embodied in it. And so this was a very important moment in his development of the idea of Parsifal. In 1877, after he had completed The Ring and directed The Ring, he produced the second prose draft and poem. So actually, when I say it has the longest gestation period, he actually didn't do much on it for 22 years. Is that 22 or 32? It's actually 32. Excuse my mathematics. Anyway, between 1877 and 1879, the music was written, and then from 1879 to 1882, the full score was written. So really, although there's a 37-year gap between conception and completion, it was an idea that had stayed in his mind for almost his entire life. It was always perhaps present in his mind. And so I think we can perhaps look on this as a summary of his life's works. But of all Wagner's music dramas, this is not only the one that is most difficult to pin down, but it is the most haunting, the most beguiling, the most mystifying, and the one that can most easily put shivers up one's spine. Let's just listen now to the first 4 minutes of the opera. This is the Prelude to Act One. So, oh, I beg your pardon. It's a work of utmost serenity, but in that prelude you first hear the very serene theme that introduces particularly the theme of the Grail, and then we hear it repeated, but in a different key and with a certain sort of hysterical quality to it that I think in many ways encapsulates what Parsifal is actually about. Now, what is it about? Well, first, some of the features of Parsifal. First, it's much more abstract than Wagner's other works. Wagner was a supremely concrete composer. He could describe human emotions with astonishing precision. He could also describe natural phenomena with tremendous imagination. His music, rather than being sort of general in the way that we're told music really appeals to people's general emotions, actually his music clothes and makes the action much more specific and deeper. This is very much characteristic of all of his major operas, with the exception of Parsifal, because in Parsifal the music seems to be different. For me, often when I hear it, it seems to be separate from the action. It seems to come from somewhere else. If you've ever heard it at Bayreuth, you'll know that when the prelude begins, you don't know where that music is. It is absolutely perfect Bayreuth music. Suddenly it's in that space, and it seems to have come from a realm that is outside our immediate understanding. We sense that the music is half describing the emotion of the characters, but it is addressed to a plane also that is beyond immediate human experience. In Parsifal, music very rarely describes incidents. There are a few incidents that are actually captured by the music, but on the whole, it tends to sort of avoid incident. It's written at an almost consistently slow pace. There are just one or two fast, sort of high-tempo movements, but on the whole, it tends to be a very, very sort of consistent, regulated music. Only occasionally does it change tempo in order to accommodate some change in the dramatic action. As a result, one has a feeling that all the characters in Parsifal are to a considerable degree controlled by forces outside themselves. And it does not fully take place in the earthly realm, but characters in fact sort of belong both to the earth and elsewhere. And in this way, it has much more of a religious dimension than any other of Wagner's music dramas. Secondly, there's a very sparse dialogue. It's the shortest of Wagner's poems by far. Actually, I'm not quite so sure if it is as short as The Flying Dutchman. I haven't checked, but certainly it is by far the shortest of all the real mature music dramas. But it has one of the longest scores. Much of the time is spent in purely orchestral music. When characters sing, they sing also either in very sparse dialogue or they also sing in long monologues. I put long speeches there actually because it reminds me it's rather like a play that is composed of a whole series of soliloquies. There's very little conversation in Parsifal, as there tends to be in most of Wagner's other works. There's little sense of communication between the characters except in Act 2. Where Parsifal and Kundry encounter each other. Another important thing, there's a heavy dependence on symbols. And if you don't grasp the symbols and ultimately try to work out in your mind what they mean, you'll find it difficult to understand the drama. The basic symbols are the Grail, the spear, Klingsor's castle, and Amfortas's wound, and these are symbols that the action is constantly revolving around. And the drama, to a considerable degree, seems to be devoted to explaining what these symbols are. But certainly it is, in terms of the drama of its time, Parsifal is very much a symbolist drama, that had a lot in common with the avant-garde drama of the time, and in fact is less realistic, and most of Wagner's earlier operas, particularly Meistersinger and The Ring, have a very, very strong realistic component. Another thing is, there's a very static action. Virtually nothing happens. Virtually nothing occurs. And yet at the same time, at the end, you think the whole world has changed. It's one of the fascinating sort of paradoxes of Parsifal, that nothing seems to happen, but eventually everything seems to have happened. In these my lectures, I'm going to try and give some idea of what has happened, but I don't know how successful I will be. Another thing is there's a minimal plot. Wagner was the most accomplished of all operatic storytellers. His plots are well constructed, incident follows incident with great clarity. Not so in Parsifal. There are 3 events which he took from the epic poem of Parsifal, and the epic poem is absolutely packed with incidents. Wagner just took 3 events and condensed everything into those events. And then finally, the hero, Parsifal, is very difficult to understand. The characters, in many ways, are unknowable, but let me just focus upon Parsifal for a bit. We know the least of all about Parsifal among Wagner's heroes. For one thing, actually, he doesn't sing very much. He has virtually nothing to sing in Act 1. He has a fair amount to sing in Act 2, but Kundry actually tends to talk more than he does. And in Act 3, Gurnemanz actually talks a little more than he does when he returns to the Grail Palace. Now, when Parsifal first appears in the domain of the Grail, he's a blank. He knows nothing. He does not know his name. He does not know where he is going. He does know he had a mother called Herzeleida, and he does know that he saw a group of knights passing by, and he was excited to join the knights as they were going out into the world. He doesn't know his name. The only action that he's associated with in Act 1 is the wanton killing of the swan, and we are aware that he has reserves of violence. So in many ways it's violence that is the first quality that we associate with Parsifal. But we do know, of course, by the end of the rite, at the end of Act 1, he certainly is capable of being moved by ritual. In Act 2, he has his momentous encounter with Kundry, in which he overcomes his desire for her, and I'm going to discuss that in more detail tomorrow. But in fact, we should just note here that the meeting with Kundry is the only occasion in which he is involved in significant struggle. And in traditional drama, as it was understood by certainly the audiences at the end of the 19th century, meaning on the stage basically comes through struggle. So we just have one struggle, which is his struggle with Kundry. And at the end of this struggle, he acquires the spear by magic. In Act 3, He returns to the Castle of the Grail. We know very little more about him. He has wandered through the world, he has suffered, he has committed errors, but he has kept the spear pure. When we see him at the end, he's changed. He's now a mature man, full of the experience of the world. I think Act 3 possibly takes place 20, 30, maybe even 40 years after Act 1 has done. But he's now a mature man, and he's hailed as the new king of the Grail, and the action ends with him assuming that position. How has he earned this divine status at the end? Well, it's very difficult to tell exactly, but at the same time, when we watch a good production on stage, we are absolutely convinced that that beatific ending at the end is warranted. But what is the meaning of the salvation that Parsifal dispenses at the end? Or, although we know so little about him, can we understand the strange influence he seems to sort of spread on everybody around him? Parsifal, when he comes on at the end, is in many ways literally one of the most charismatic figures in opera, because he seems to have the power to change all the people around him. So the rapturous end of Parsifal is strangely moving. It's a triumphant ending, but it's not that easy to account for. Now, how do we get into this work? Well, last time we discussed Parsifal, which was, well, about 12 years ago now. I'm sure some of you were there, but I chose to approach it through the ideas of Arthur Schopenhauer and Thomas Carlyle, which actually is a very interesting way of approaching it, but it's effective, but I think perhaps a little bit laborious. When we go to watch theatrical works, whether they're operas or plays, we tend not to go have a raft of ideas in the forefront of our minds and expect to see those ideas being demonstrated on stage. Rather, the ideas come to us after the performance rather than during the performance. The ideas tend to come later in contemplation. So what I'd like to do today and tomorrow is to approach Parsifal from a more visceral point of view. How does it work on us as a piece of theatre? What is our response to it as a piece of theatre? And to answer this, I'd like to visit a frequently discussed matter, and this is, what is the difference between theatre and ritual? And then, furthermore, is Parsifal primarily a work of theatre, or is it a ritual? And you might think, well, that sounds a very academic sort of question, but actually it's quite important, because it will actually introduce us to the unique nature of Parsifal. Now, a few general comments on rituals. Ritual was very common in opera, particularly in the 19th century. 19th century grand opera loved ritual. Of course, the first one thinks of is Aida, with the religious rites in the first act, and then the return of the troops from battle to Thebes in the second act. Other composers who loved ritual, one was Meyerbeer, who put on great services. There are also there are operas with great trials. Wagner, of course, was very adept at representing ritual on the stage. Think of Lohengrin, which is absolutely packed full of rituals from beginning to end. In fact, one of the things about Lohengrin, it seems to almost never get away from ritual. It always seems to be somehow concerned with a ritual. Now, Parsifal also has ritual. It has two very crucial scenes of ritual, one at the end of Act 1, one at the end of Act 3. And for many people, the rituals in Parsifal can be taken just as we take the rituals in Lohengrin or Aida. In other words, there are events that take place on the stage that need to take place because this tells the story. But whereas I think all of us would agree that Aida is primarily an opera and a secular experience, far fewer people will be prepared to grant that to Parsifal. The rituals that we see in Parsifal seem to invite and even insist upon a commitment by the audience that dissolves the barrier between the stage and the auditorium. And as a result, the rituals are not only the subject of drama, but we might argue that they are the way in which they work upon the audience, and the audience has a palpable relationship between the auditorium and the stage in a ritualistic as well as in a theatrical manner. Just a brief anecdote. When I was talking on Parsifal at Bayreuth several years ago, and in the evening went to the performance of Bayreuth, and for some reason I was in a terrible bad mood. I was just sort of grumpy. I don't know what it was, but anyway, I went and watched the first act and came out and was in no better a mood than I was when I went in. And then there were a group of people who I'd talked to in the morning, and we started talking. And one lady said to me, "Are you enjoying it?" And I was about ready to sort of say, well, try to make some sort of cutting or ironic comment. And she looked at me and her eyes lit up and said, "This is the most marvelous experience of my life." I thought, gosh, you can't cut somebody down from that. So I shut up. The interesting thing is, I went back with her words ringing in my ears, and I thought, I'll try to listen with her ears and see with her eyes. And it became one of the most marvelous experiences of my life toward the end. It's very interesting. It has a very different sort of relationship with the audience than other operas seem to do. And for several, and including me, Parsifal is a unique work because it is at one and the same time a drama that one observes and a ritual that one participates in. And now, historically, ritual and drama are very closely allied. If any of you have taken Theatre History 101, you will know that the Festival of Dionysus, the first great theatre, arose essentially from the worship of Dionysus and indeed from other ritualistic customs in Athens in the classical period. But in both Asia and in Europe, drama is considered widely to have arisen from ritual, both religious ritual and political ritual. And religious and political leaders, of course, have often used drama, and opera especially, for ritualistic purposes. Think of all those princes in the 18th century who built their theatres essentially to impress their subjects and to impress guests. If you had a splendid opera, this actually reflected upon the splendor of your own wealth and of your own position. So opera has quite a complex relationship with the idea of ritual. But fundamentally, ritual and theatre are two different things. And what I would like to do now is just explain how this is so. First, in ritual and drama, here I have this up as a complete table. First, ritual is an act of worship. We don't go to the theatre to worship. We go to the theatre to see a representation of life. Well, that's a pretty general sort of comment, but I think you know as essentially what I mean there. Secondly, a ritual requires the people who attend it to participate, to actually believe in the values or in the divinity that is evoked by the ritual. In other words, ritual requires people who come to see it to become a congregation. Drama requires the attendance of the engagement of attendees, but it hopes to in fact grab their close attention, not by saying, I want you to completely agree with the ideas that are being put forward here, but rather, I want you to be fascinated by the ideas and the action that are being put forward here. And the theatre does not ask people who attend it to actually literally believe in what is happening on the stage. We are expected to observe what is happening on the stage with irony, and we get many truths from what we see on the stage, which we can then apply to different events in life. Both ritual and theatre tell stories. The ritual does it primarily through narrative and quasi-dramatic passages that recreate through ceremonial language and gestures and often movement and music as well, that recreate the values of the past, either literally or in the congregation's imagination. Now, drama also tells stories, but it tends to do this through representation, through actually showing. And in other words, it's much closer to the events of everyday life than ritual is. And one of the things about theatre is it produces a very vivid illusion of present life. That does not necessarily mean to say it's realistic. It can be all sorts of different modes, but when you go to see a really good theatre production, it's vivid. And of course, the thing that what you leave from the theatre production is you leave with the images literally sort of emblazoned in your mind. Often in really good productions, they're traumatic and will stay with you for the rest of your life. That's a very different appeal, though, than what ritual has. Now, another important thing here is ritual on the whole. Now, you can probably draw some exceptions here, but ritual on the whole is devoted to repeating truths from the past or an eternal truth. We believe that by participating in ritual, the values from the past revive us, give us new energy. Drama, on the contrast, or theatre, though it's often set in the past, actually is normally concerned with the creation of new experience. So actually what I'd say is ritual repeats, and repeats essentially the same truth. The idea that if we get access to that truth, we will be given new life and new energy. Theatre does not do that. Ritual is also based upon the assumption that human nature does not change. Or perhaps I might say differently, should not change, because it seems to me it's almost impossible not to change as we go through this life. But in some ways, ritual resists change, in contrast to the theatre that centres above all on the changeability of the human experience. If you think of the great plays and operas with which you are familiar, the change of characters as they go through the action is absolutely central to what the whole work is about. And finally, one other thing, ritual gives the impression that once we have entered into it and absorbed it and become part with it, we control the world. Theatre does not assume any such thing. After you've gone to see a play, you might be greatly entertained, you might be invigorated. There are all sorts of ways in which you might sort of be happier, but you don't come out basically saying, I'm king of the world. When you come out of ritual, it's been done well, maybe you could say that. In other words, you feel that you have sort of somehow got a sort of an energy within yourself which will withstand the world around you. Now, this difference, by the way, was very closely clearly displayed in the Middle Ages. For example, the church used the dramatic representation to bring the myth of Christ closer to the congregation. And liturgical drama was actually quite widely performed in the course of the Middle Ages and actually became very elaborate. This led to the elaborate, complex, and massive and wonderful tradition of the medieval mystery plays. Here we have got the picture, historical reproduction of a medieval mystery cycle in Metz in present-day Germany. These performances, which took place outside, were there to celebrate essentially the life of Christ, but also everything that came before the life of Christ and everything that might come after the life of Christ. But these performances of mystery cycles became more and more elaborate. And the more elaborate they came, the more people enjoyed them, the more they started laughing at the devils and and responding in a very sort of secular way, the more the church withdrew from it. And gradually the mystery cycles became performed primarily by the secular guilds, and the church didn't like it. And since then, the church has always suspected the theatre. It suspects the theatre because it thinks audiences are more interested in the devil than they are in God. And maybe they might be, because actually the devil is very entertaining in the theatre, whereas God can get a little bit tiring at times. In Spain, when they put on autos sacramentales, which were mystery cycles as well, they actually put on dancing girls, which seemed to invite the worship of something other than God. And there are wonderful manuscripts of monks and sort of various members of the church inveighing against these performances, because they had moved way beyond their initial starting in ritual. Ultimately, the church resisted and then actively attacked the theatre, and the church and theatre remained at odds throughout the 19th century. And interestingly enough, when Parsifal was first performed in Bayreuth in 1882, it could only be performed at Bayreuth. It would not be allowed to be performed on any public theatre because it represents a ritual. Now, actually, in many ways, it represents a Christian ritual because the music and a lot of the words are very are very reminiscent of the actual Christian Mass. And so I'm not quite so sure that censors at the time would actually have appreciated the fact that the presence of Schopenhauer's ideas and things like this actually took it away from being a Mass. But certainly in 1882, it could only be done in Bayreuth. So although the ritual in Parsifal is not literally that of the church, it was close enough to give the illusion that it was. Now, the unique aspect of Parsifal for me is it combines ritual and drama in a way that I don't think any other stage work in the mainstream repertoire does. But I would be very interested to hear from you if you feel there are other works that have this particular sort of quality. And for 100 years after its premiere, there had been a tremendous critical discussion that focused upon what sort of work it is. Is it a religious ritual or is it not? And very frequently, this was conducted by very partisan, rather narrow critics who felt that a work was only good if it actually fitted a specific category, a defined category, that it was a tragedy or a comedy. Well, in actuality, Parsifal is none of these things. Wagner himself called it a Bühnenfest. Gosh, excuse me. Yes, anyway, you know what I'm talking about, okay? Yes, okay. Now, some scholars still see it as akin to an act of worship or ritual. Michael Tanner, quite interestingly actually, writes about Parsifal as an exercise in the psychopathology of religious belief, that he thinks basically this is essentially what it is. However, and he also sees it as an Ibsenesque drama. And actually, one of the interesting things about the version of Parsifal we are seeing is there's quite an Ibsenesque quality in a lot of the exchanges between the different characters. I'd like to revisit this issue, though, from the postmodern view of our own time. Which sees it as unwise to insist that any work, to be of quality, must fit very neatly critical definitions of genre. On the contrary, actually, now on the whole, we tend to see generic diversity in a work as a strength rather than a weakness. We now value works highly because they violate and even transcend the strict definitions of genre. We're now even capable of seeing Wagner's operas and Shakespeare's tragedies being performed in a comic mode. And it's not quite as violating as one might think. Actually, one can get considerable power out of those approaches. But we're much more open to changes in genre. But of all Wagner's works, Parsifal was the most transgressive in genre and the most transcendent. Whereas it seems to me The Ring is a good classical tragedy with strong Shakespearean elements, and Die Meistersinger is without doubt a Shakespearean comedy. Parsifal does not fit any of those categories at all, because both ritual and drama are at work in it, and it appeals to us in different ways at different times in the action. For example, there's a very triptych quality to the work. Remember, triptychs were three pictures that were put up on the top of medieval altars. Here we have a triptych from a continental church where we have two sort of side panels, and then the central panel, which is the Annunciation of Jesus' birth to Mary. The Parsifal is very much like a trilogy. Act 1 and Act 3 are heavily ritualistic in form and idiom. Both of them end with elaborately staged rituals of the exposure of the Grail in the castle of Monsalvat. And this, as I mentioned, is akin to, though is not identical with Christian communion, but it does involve words saying, eat bread and drink my blood. Many audiences as a result, tend to experience Parsifal as being close to a religious service. There are times when the audience feels itself transformed into a congregation, and the music drama can turn into a ritual and is often treated as a ritual by the company that is performing it. Parsifal, more than any other work, seems to ask us to believe in it as an act of worship. Hence the convention that Act One should not be applauded. I am thoroughly in approval of that convention, because I find at the end that it is so I'm so moved by what I've been seeing, and I have been taken out of myself in a different way than when I see more secular operas, that applause just doesn't seem to be relevant. Actually, I think a lot of applause in opera should go. There are lots of operas I don't like applauding. Othello, for example, shouldn't be applauded. It ends with beautiful quietness. Just get up and walk out of the house. Siegfried can be applauded. That ends noisily. Okay. So Act One and Act Three tend to have different rituals, and I'm going to go into those rituals in a little bit more detail later. Act Two, however, the central panel of the triptych, is far more dramatic. And Wagner, sitting in that box that Ori sat in, I hope that when you were there, Ori, you did what Wagner did on the first night of Parsifal. Yes. But how about in Act Two? Did you clap halfway through? Because Wagner actually did clap on the first night. He clapped the flower maidens, and everyone went shh, 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 and he got real huffy and said, "I can't even clap in my own opera house." But it is interesting. Actually, I find that that it's almost a natural thing to applaud the flower maidens, who are very beautiful, very stagey creatures. They come straight from French operetta. Wagner was actually very skilled in writing that sort of music. But anyway, certainly Act Two is much more theatrical. And it is also dramatic, because it is the one act that shows the process of change that happens through a conflict between earthly beings. And it focuses in particular on sexual conflict, and that is what I'm going to be really focusing upon tomorrow. So in dramatic form, it tends to be quite similar to the medieval triptychs that could be seen on altars. And we do know that Wagner did go and study these triptychs. We have evidence of him going to churches in several different towns and looking at these altarpieces. It's also very ritualistic, I think, in its literary mode. As I've mentioned before, there's very little dialogue in Parsifal, and it's not a conversation opera like The Ring or Die Meistersinger, where people sit down and have wonderful flowing conversations in a totally spontaneous way, which was actually one of Wagner's great genius, one of the great genius things that he did do. But instead, we have long passages of narrative exposition, and any communication between individuals is spare. It's often repetitive. It seems to take place within a formal framework which recalls the formality of ritual, and it is slow. It is slow. It is slow. It is slow. So much that you actually do feel that characters are determined by the slowness. But actually, again, I think one of the great aspects of genius in Parsifal is it's not boring. It's never boring. It is constantly fascinating, but we actually listen to the world essentially slowed down. But actually, even the dramatic duet between Parsifal and Kundry in Act Two actually involves essentially the exchange of long solo passages rather than the cut and thrust of dialogue. So even dramatic passages tend to retain a formality that is associated with ritual. In the music of Parsifal seems to me to be unequaled in its refinement and beauty. And unlike, I think, the music written for any other music drama or opera, though I'm looking forward to hearing what Geoffrey has to say about this, as one of his lectures is very tantalizingly focused upon the music as a summary of Wagner's life. Maybe I got it wrong, but there we are. Most operatic music, however, is dramatic in character. It expresses the inner feelings of the characters. It articulates the conflict between them. It's used to describe landscapes, both intimate and broad. Music is the most ideal medium for pageantry and spectacle. But in Parsifal, the music addresses neither the inner nor the outer worlds. If it addresses emotions, it touches on them, it suggests them rather than fully explores them, with the exception of the Parsifal-Kundry duet, which is the one duet where we do go deep inside the characters. But on the whole, we tend to sort of just touch upon emotions. And Wagner himself wrote about this when he said, when I was rehearsing Parsifal, I discovered that the best way to do it was not to ask the characters to do complete gestures and become complete realistic figures, but always just to suggest a half gesture. In other words, there was a sort of a real restraint in the acting that complemented the music and again has the formality of ritual about it. If the music is applied to spectacle in Parsifal, it's only in a very perfunctory manner. For example, Parsifal's approach to Klingsor's castle and the battle with the knights in Act 2, if this had been Lohengrin, we'd have about 20 minutes of battle and choruses sort of yelling at each other and conflict going on stage. But in Parsifal, it is only described and not represented. We don't see it. And then when we do see the collapse of the castle at the end, the whole thing is over in a few seconds. When you go to see Parsifal next time, right at the very end, make sure you don't blink because you might miss the collapse of the castle. Instead, as I said before, the music seems to connect characters to something outside and beyond them. And we feel them as being as much part of the metaphysical world as the physical world. They are part of the ritual as well as characters within the drama. And I find as the drama goes on, it appears to gain power, ritual gains power as the action develops. And just to play a brief extract here, this is from page 20 in the Schirmer, the Schirmer libretto, halfway down column 1. This is the moment where Parsifal is baptized and blessed before he goes into the temple. And we can get here very strongly this sense of a very sort of cool, very calm, very stately emotions that has about it the dignity of ritual. Now, ritual doesn't only determine the form and the style of the work. I think Parsifal is actually about ritual. This is its basic theme. As the action progresses, in fact, Wagner seems to me to increasingly favor the values of ritual above those of theatre. In fact, I'm beginning to think that Parsifal is one of those rare but extremely valuable works. It's a great anti-theatrical masterpiece, because in some ways it seems to throw a rather doubtful light upon theatrical qualities. Ritual, of course, is more than just a religious phenomenon. A few weeks ago, I was listening to Morning Report on NPR, and they had their social affairs or their social science correspondent come and talk about an experiment that's just been going on at Stanford University, in which they try to work out how there's a sort of ritual relationships can be developed between people. And it was a very complex experiment, and I don't want to explain all of it, but the one thing was that, in fact, the people who are conducting the experiment gave certain members of a test group numbers and letters that were the same, and then it gave other people totally random numbers and letters, and they asked people to sort of show their numbers and letters, and gradually a group of 5 or 6 people that all had the same numbers and letters all gathered together, and everybody else was standing apart. And they found instantly that there was a sense of identity between those people, which carried on into further sort of episodes of the experiment, whereas those who hadn't received those particular, the magic letters and numbers, actually felt quite alienated. Because, in fact, it's interesting how an idea of similarity between people and it sort of creates not only a sense of, both a sense of community and a sense of ritual, because they found that this group gradually developed rituals. Now, the ritual tends to work, its idea is to unify human beings. But ritual, of course, is a double-edged sword, as it was in this experiment. It can create communities, but it can also create divisions. Rituals can be exclusive. If they are pursued with commitment by their participants, they give the participants new energy and a sense of common purpose, and the capacity to deny whatever inner impulse or interest that divide them. So I should just say, ritual is there to create a sense of unity among people, which might even diffuse the various tensions that might exist between these people if they were not in a religious, in a ritual environment. But of course, those who are excluded and do not wish to be will become hostile and directly opposed to the spirit of this particular ritual. Now, it's axiomatic in the modern world that traditional ritualistic structures have lost their power. This applies in particular to various sort of religious bodies. The growth of cities has destroyed small rural communities in which most people lived, and the church has constantly been fighting against the loss of believers. But new rituals are now actually being set up in our society. Societies are a sort of one example of a group of people who meet because of common interests, and gradually sort of certain ritualistic qualities might develop in their actual in meeting. Sports, absolutely dominated by ritual. Political assemblies, very frequently dominated by ritual. Pop concerts also have a very ritualistic content to them. We also, by the way, adopt rituals in our personal life. And the purpose of these rituals is to give us identity, self-confidence, and new energy. I don't know about you, but when I was a little kid, I was told that you could not tread in the cracks on the paving stones. And if I did, I would get bad luck. Even to this day, I don't tread on the cracks if I can't, even though I know, it's just, but the thing is, it's something that allows you to get some sense of sort of identity in the world and defense also against the world. Now, the topic of Parsifal, I think, is how to create a ritual that incorporates us, all of us, and that creates a sense of coherence in society that will prevent it from disintegrating. But the brothers of the Brotherhood, or the knights of the Brotherhood, are failing. They have failed to sustain that sense of community. And I think we should take that community that the brothers stand for in the way that the director of the recent production at the Met did, that community is the community of the earth. You know, you saw those knights almost sort of gathering around on a sort of a quasi-globe on the stage. And that, I think, is what Wagner is writing about. How can we create a ritual that incorporates everyone? And in particular, what must Parsifal undergo in order to restore that sense of a whole ritual? Now, I'd suggest that Wagner places contrasting values on ritual and opera. Drama focuses upon the clash of opposites. Drama thrives on division. It thrives on representing with fullness everything in the human condition of evil and good. Now, drama is not entirely absent in Parsifal. There are some very dramatic moments in Acts 1 and 3, but they tend to represent violence and discord rather than unity. The knights' contempt for Kundry, the confrontation between the knights and Amfortas in Act 1 and Act 3 are very good examples of theatre and drama representing conflict between people, and therefore something that is opposite to the ideals that ritual is moving towards. And just finally, let me just play one other section. This is Parsifal's first appearance as he slays the swan in Act 1, and you will hear how the music suddenly changes into something much more dramatic, much more jagged. We haven't heard this. And then on comes Gaudeaman's, and he settles it down with his rather stately ritualistic statement. Here we have it.
Was ist denn und dir?
So, theatre, drama, expresses divisions, often hatred and suspicion between individuals, and yet there's a counterforce that is associated more with ritual that in fact tries to sort of bring people more together. Tomorrow, I'll explore the significance of ritual in saving the world. In Parsifal, we hear a lot about sickness. We have a tremendous concern with human sexuality and its capacity to erode the human will. There are questions of faith, and in particular questions of human beings as natural as well as social beings. And there's also the issue of the Grail and what it stands for. But I think I will be focusing mainly upon ritual, but above all, I think one interesting thing about Parsifal is we sense in Parsifal from the very beginning that we are in a tragic world, but somehow at the end, tragedy is avoided. And what that avoidance is something we might want to explore. So we will explore the connections of all these issues to the question of ritual and the efficacy of ritual in human society. Interestingly enough, while the landscape of Parsifal seems to be archaic, it was taken from medieval epic. The Brotherhood was always associated with the Knights of the Round Table. Oh, I thought I had a picture of them up there. And while Titurel is a figure of immense age, in actuality, Parsifal spoke very directly to the audiences of the late 19th century. It was a tremendous success when it was first premiered at Bayreuth in 1882, and even made money for the institution. So perhaps we should also consider why and how this archaic world actually appeals to our modern secular age. How can we read it ultimately as a parable for our time? Thank you very much.
Music Wagner ever wrote, and it's the last music he wrote, essentially. And it has to do with his sense of tremendous guilt of having murdered his father, he feels like. And, of course, Titurel is an extremely, let's say, controversial figure. In the famous Wieland Wagner Parsifal Cross, Titurel stands for he's the opposite of Kundry, but not in a good way. I mean, Titurel is artificially being kept alive because he's afraid of death by the Grail. Kundry is looking for death to release her from her curse. I think Kundry is a far more positive figure than Titurel. Far more. Titurel is the Froma held, the pious hero and everything, but as he is at the end, he's become pathetic and rather dreadful, I think.
When Titurel, you don't hear
No, you
No,
don't.
he's never on stage.
He's usually played behind scenes.
He's
Yeah.
not supposed to be on stage.
Yeah.
The only time that made a mockery of one of the great places in the score, the place where they open the tomb and all of them make that scream and run back. Now, that's in the score. But of course, in this production, it made no sense because he's been out there all along.
Mm-hmm.
So why all of a sudden would they? Yeah.
Well, they haven't seen him there. They've seen him in the tomb,
Okay.
and then he's put on the stage.
All right. So he's less. Yeah.
Mark.
In Act One, Tintorell is brought up apparently from a tomb, and then decades later, they finally get around to formally burying him, it seems, with this ceremony. So I'm not quite sure what's going on.
Yeah, it's. I think we have to accept it. It's not realism. It's not a realistic. And that production was not realistic. That production brought together military uniforms from the Oriental Middle Ages, from the First World War. The Titurel had quite clearly was probably about sort of 250 to 300 years old. And I don't think we should read it as being a realistic drama. We should read it as being a symbolic drama. And in that way, actually, that production makes a hell of a lot of sense. If we read it symbolically rather than realistically.
What about the performance? Anybody have any comments on the performances? Yeah.
I just want to say that, we talked earlier about how singers probably don't want to sing Kundry because she doesn't do anything on the third act. I just want to say, in this case, Valtraud Meyer has such a big impact in the third act without saying anything, just because she's such a great actress.
Yeah. And Christophe
Can I just add to that? The reason I chose this version because it is the only acceptable ending of Parsifal that I have seen in the modern theatre, where actually Kundry stays alive and she goes out and they are going out to create new life. And even though this is not literally what Wagner represented, in many ways in spirit it is exactly what he was writing about. And there's something I find intensely moving about that ending. I remember when I saw it in San Francisco, and it seemed to take much longer. And it was really deeply moving to see those people moving out, and then the knights breaking off and suddenly saying, yes, maybe we go after Kundry rather than stay within our circle. And you got a sense of a real transformation taking place, which I have rarely seen, even in the Met production where Kundry dies at the end, which was very moving at the end. It seemed to me it downgraded her in comparison to this production.
I'm glad to hear you say that, because in your lecture, when you were talking about ritual and drama, I sort of got the impression that ritual was so static that it didn't allow for the people who attended the ritual to go forth and transform. But now it makes sense when I see that ending and when you explain it, that the way that ritual and drama interact.
Yes. It is a moment where the ritual begins to change.
The ritual is a prelude to transformation.
I think
and they're genuine bound.
I think it's a very incorrect, I don't think it's Simon's intent, it's a very incorrect reading of Parsifal to say ritual bad.
I didn't say that.
No, I know you didn't. No, but I'm saying, I don't think that's Wagner's intent at all.
Yeah.
But Wagner wrote a very unpleasant, most of the essays in the last part of his life are very hard reading, and probably would have been better if they had never been published, and they're half ghostwritten. But in Kunst und Religion, one of the very last, and a particularly unpleasant piece of work, there is something he writes about which is important in the light of Parsifal, which is when he says that art takes over where religion stops.
Yes.
In other words, art,
Yeah.
to the 19th century, art has become not so much the replacement of religion, but its continuity, its furtherance.
It's taking
and
it over. Yeah.
so the ritual, the ritual of Parsifal, the ritual of opera performance, the ritual that are depicted in Parsifal need renovation. After all, that's also symbolic of the whole idea of the Bühnenfestspiel. That he's writing a piece to dedicate a new theater, to dedicate a new kind of theatrical work as well. And even though they look very, I'm sure you'll show pictures of it tomorrow for us. Are you doing your normal production?
I am indeed, yes.
You have pictures of the original Yukovsky sets?
I have, yes.
Okay, well, those are usually terrible.
We'll look at them.
And they stayed in Bayreuth until about 1930 or something like that.
Yes,
Because unfortunately for Wagner, he died too soon to have a chance to get rid of them. unlike the
And he
Ring
would have
says.
done. He would have got. Of
course he would.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, I do think, regardless of what you do with Kundry at the end, it makes a whole lot more dramatic sense for Amfortas to die.
that's all he's been longing to do.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that I've seen in quite a few productions. The most out, I don't know, how many, I'm sure many of you saw the Schlingensief at Bayreuth.
I didn't see that.
Okay, the Schlingensief, see there. So they come back, and he has this, Parsifal has the spear.
Yeah.
So he comes in, and yes, Amfortas dies, but he shouldn't be actually murdered by Parsifal.
No.
Parsifal runs him through, and then he runs
no,
Gornemans through, then he runs Kundry through, and
No, that's not.
then he kills.
That's not the spirit.
Then he kills himself, and then Klingzor comes running on the stage, grabs the spear from the dying Parsifal, and gets into kind of a rocket ship, goes off, the curtain comes down, and all during the final chorus we see that enormous rabbit being devoured by maggots.
And what did the audience do when the curtain went down?
I think everybody was pretty, I mean, some of us have seen it before, but yeah. What? Yeah, there was the one, at the
dead
end there was
rabbit,
this one
yeah.
enormous, I mean, you know, the stage of Bayreuth is big, and that rabbit covered the entire stage, and it was being very,
The one being eaten by maggots.
maggots, yeah. Very gruesomely, I mean, being eaten by maggots, and that's but having Amfortas die strikes me as a rather good idea.
Oh yeah. And Amfortas just dies. He actually just dies in Parsifal's arm.
Yeah,
You know,
which was fine. That was very moving.
It's very humane. I thought that worked very well.
was
Yeah.
very moving. I mean,
Yeah.
he's right on the verge in any case. So.
Actually, I found the one problem with the movie is it's all a little bit too congested on the stage. Actually, I showed you that picture this morning of where in fact the stage is quite a bit broader, and it actually has more stateliness as a result, even though it's those very sort of downgraded costumes. It's lots of greys, lots of dark colors. You still actually get the sense of a little bit more stately ritual about it. And in this, it was not quite so.
I just wonder why they mess around with the balances so ridiculously.
With which?
With the balance, with the sound.
With the orchestra.
I mean, it's amazing because the orchestra sounds fine in the solo parts.
Yes.
And you know,
Yeah,
and you know, but and it's not as if you can't hear the singers. I mean, you hear the singers.
Singers are
great.
fine. Yeah.
Yeah, you still hear the orchestra.
Yeah, no, I agree.
In
I
Wagner,
agree.
that's a problem.
Yeah, Wagner is. Yeah, the orchestra is important.
Yeah.
Is everyone agreed that Amfortas should die in the end rather than recover his will to live the way Kundry does and go off redeemed?
No, but we've all agreed that we thought it was a reasonable solution.
I think it's a reasonable solution, and Kundry in Wagner has her die. She sinks lifeless to the ground because she's had a life of torment.
But then she gets up and walks off with him in the
Well,
last
no,
stage
in this
direction.
In this production,
In the stage directions.
No.
No, I don't think so.
No. Stage direction, there's that fantastic modulation he never does any other time in the opera.
Am I reading a
A
different
flat
version?
major and A minor, and then Kundry sinks in Zelt zum Boden, and that's the last we heard about her. So she gives up her soul and sinks to the ground.
It seems to me that the Kundry, the changing the death from Amfortas, from Kundry to Amfortas, is actually a really humane ending.
Well, what did he do with his crown? He gave his crown to Gornemans at the end?
No, he gives his crown to Titurel. He just leaves it there as if the crown is worth nothing now. So there was a very, very distinct sort of German left-wing comment there. I
Yes,
think.
I think so. Yeah, I think you're probably right. I don't think Scruton would have liked that one.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Yeah, Kundry and Parsifal are going to have children. That's essentially how I read that.
Namely Lohengrin, for one.
Is what? Lohengrin? Oh yes, Lohengrin's going to come out of that.
Yes.
Yeah. But no, you do get that sense that this is new life coming out of them.
Yes. By the way, it's silly. I mean, we're joking about the Lohengrin thing. I mean, Wagner is not conceiving of these as companion pieces.
No.
This is not a prequel to Lohengrin in the way that what do you call it? The Barber Seville is a prequel of
The Marriage of Figaro. Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
different kind of dramas. Yes.
Though actually, it's interesting to speculate on the relationship between the two, because Wagner must have had Lohengrin in mind as he was writing Parsifal.
Well, because he quotes it all the time. Yeah, and he quotes it with the swan, but he refers to it a lot.
Yes, the dead swan rather than the live swan. Yeah.
Why does the end want you to be so funny?
Be what?
There's much love to be so funny.
Who?
You do.
I don't find the end funny.
I find the end to be
I find the end moving.
moving and sublime, but
Sublime and
Oh.
it just strikes me. The end discussion compared to, let's say, Nibelungen and others, when we discussed the end, there was an outburst of good ideas, intelligent ideas, and
we're being attacked.
Well,
am I the only one?
I don't know what the problem is. Is what?
He's saying that we're showing outrageous levity by laughing after a performance of Parsifal. I can see that. Why not? Call a spade a spade.
I just find it a very positive, encouraging ending. When I leave that production, I don't feel myself ground down into the earth as if I'm one of those knights clinging to the old worked out rituals. I actually feel myself filled with energy. I can remember going out of seeing this production in San Francisco, really quite joyful.
That leads to my question. Two-part. It was Baden-Baden the last time this production has been performed, and then at the other venues, San Francisco and Chicago, did the production change at all in any of its?
Not as far as I know. All I can say is I saw the San Francisco and this is pretty close to what I remember on the stage. And it was actually had a pretty quick transit from the ENO in London to San Francisco and then back to Chicago. Then this one is actually a few years later.
I thought the rock in Chicago, the rock reappeared, the meteor.
Maybe it did, I don't know. I can't explain that meteor.
What is the rock supposed to signify?
It's the rock that you see at the very beginning. There's been, it's like a meteor has hit the earth, and there's been, this is sort of a post-Holocaust almost sort of event. I can't quite explain that to myself. But.
Also, I think the curved back wall,
Yeah.
I think is the bending of space and time.
Oh,
Yes, particularly when you have those chairs placed on it in a way that you can't quite work out how it is. Yeah. The train, the train, I presume, is Auschwitz. You know, this is what. But I mean, you know, it's just in if you think of modern German history, a railway line, a rather broken down railway line going into darkness, really only means one thing. And again, I would read the ending as they're walking out. They're going out to redeem the darkness of the past as well. It's an image that's alluded to, and you know, some people. I think most people will get it, actually, particularly if they know German history.
I wonder, I'd like to ask, what do you think was the motivation for Wagner to make all of these operas so long, particularly this one? I felt that there's a lot of time that was effectively wasted in some of the dialogue.
So I didn't quite catch that. Why
is it so long?
Why is it so long?
Why is it so long? What motivated him to do that? Was he paid by the word or something? By the king?
Well,
Yep.
I just couldn't disagree more. I guess to me the third act of Tosca, which is what 18 minutes long, is unbearably long. And after 5 minutes,
it's the first 10 minutes is unbearably long.
Yeah.
The shooting's okay.
Yeah, that's right. Shooting's fine. Yes, but the point is, I guess what's long is what interests you and holds your attention. There is a very what makes Parsifal's length different, let's say, than Meistersinger's or Brüderdämmerungs, which are more or less. Those are the three very long Wagner operas. This is that Parsifal. They say less happens, and it's the pace which is slow. But if you're caught up in the pace, and you're caught up in the sort of inner feeling and inner aesthetic, inner emotion of the pace, it's enthralling, ecstatic, and not at all boring. I don't love Parsifal in the same way that I love The Ring or Tristan, let's say, or Meistersinger, although I love parts of Parsifal very, very much. But I'm not the slightest bit bored by Parsifal. And one thing is very, very much, it does not gain by being cut. The Tristan at the Met this last year was very heavily cut in the second act. And it's been a while since I've seen a cut performance of a major Wagner opera, of a mature Wagner opera. And one of the things that becomes very apparent, it would be like cutting in the way the pieces are composed. It's like cutting in a novel